Sampo. My name is Kunzang Choden, and today I'm going to be reading you a story from my book, Bhutanese Tales of the Yeti. And I've chosen to read a story called The Boots for the Migoi or the Yeti. Shall we begin? Boots for the Migoi, the Yeti. Mimi, or Grandfather Pema, was a tanner. He was the only one in the village and one of the few in the entire valley of Tang. He was a big, quiet, and dignified man who spoke little. He worked hard, and like most people in the village, he loved his ara, the country liquor every household in Bhutan distilled from its grains. Day after day, Mimpema worked on curing leather and processing hides. First, the raw hide had to be soaked in the water for days, and then the fur had to be scraped off. He had to then clean and scrape the hide further, after which he pulled and rolled it on the frame to make it supple and palatable. When the material was softer and more workable, he would apply handfuls of shingmar, the oily extract from a certain tree, and knead the hide for days. It was tough work that demanded both skill and patience. Mimpema never ceased to be proud of the final product, and he loved the clean, smooth quality of leather, which he fashioned into various useful items. People often teased him, saying that his forehead glistened in the sun as he sat on his porch, engrossed in his work. Mimpema was completely bald. A shiny patch of skin extended upwards from his forehead right down to the nape of his neck. Clumps of grey hair emerged as two bushy patches above each ear. His tiny eyes would twinkle mischievously every time he repeated a pearl of wisdom that he claimed to have learned from his grandfather. Hairy people are the descendants of monkeys, and we bald people are descendants of the nobility. Choktor, the village clown, had his own theory. No, Mimpema, looking at your size and your baldness, you must be the descendant of the nobility of the Gredpo. From then onwards, people playfully called him Mimi Gredpo or Grandpa Yeti. Mimpema and Amyangchen lived in a modest house in Pralang in the lower Tang Valley. They had a perpetual stream of visitors. There were people who would come to ask the old man to do some work or for those who came to settle old dues. His services were well sought after. There were hides, straps to be made into leather ropes, leather bags to be stitched for storage of grains and flour, and leather soles for boots. Mimpema was flexible about the modes of payment as long as he was paid somehow, sometime. He was rarely paid in cash, for cash was a privilege restricted to the rich. He was often paid in leather. He would cure and stitch a pair of soles for boots and was given an extra one, which he could sell as payment. Sometimes people gave him grains, butter, or meat for services he rendered. There were others who would pledge a few days of labor for a pair of leather boots. As a result, although the couple was childless, they were never lonely and lived in relative comfort. Mimpema rarely traveled, but when he did, he always had a piece of hide in his hands which he kneaded as he chanted the Buddhist mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. A young Jin would insist that he carry his prayer beads instead, but the old man preferred the hide, saying, I pray in my mind, not with my hands. This is how he traveled to Pokpe one year. Every autumn, his brother's family would migrate to the lower feeding grounds in Kurte, an old custom which is followed faithfully to this day. This was an annual event, and Mimpema willingly participated in it. He traveled together with everyone on the first day of the journey. They arrived at a large open field in the midst of the dark forest of conifers, situated at the base of the 4,019-meter high Rudungla. On the other side of Rudungla lay the semi-tropical pastures where the cattle would be kept for at least 6 months of the year. Of course, it was Mimpema's genuine concern for his brother that took him on this annual expedition. But he revelled in the farewell drinks, and he and his brother shared as they slurred and mumbled their goodbyes and words of advice to one another over gallons of the intoxicant. Mimpema lay on the boulder with a fixed grin on his face as he watched the departing procession, which was soon hidden in the clouds of dust raised by the hoofs of the animals. Mimpema remembered forcing himself to stay awake in order to get a last glimpse of the procession disappearing into the spruce and hemlock forest. Suddenly he felt a soothing, lulling sensation overtake his entire body. It was as if he was rising into the air like a piece of cotton, flitting, flitting, flitting. He was falling into a drunken stupor. He had no idea for how long he slept, and when he did eventually wake up, his back ached from the hard rock on which he had lain. His sunburned skin felt taut and painful, and his chin was wet from the saliva drooling from the sides of his mouth. He opened his eyes, and the sun was shining brightly from a deep blue sky. There was total silence all around. He lay there for a while, taking in the new sensations. Then automatically his hand reached into his go pouch in search of the hide. He got up with a start when his probing hands failed to find it. He stood up in irritation and looked all around, for he felt quite lost without a piece of hide. He got off the stone perch and searched in the dwarf bamboo and marsh that surrounded the boulder. There it was, his nice clean hide in a pool of fetid, marshy water soaked thoroughly and discolored by the black, murky earth. He picked up the hide and inspecting it, wondering what he could do next when he got a whiff of something dreadful. He was just about to take a closer sniff at the hide when a shadow fell across his path. He looked up, and his vision was blurred and blocked by an enormous hulk that had positioned itself in front of him. Involuntarily, he took a few steps back when he saw an animal of some kind standing on its hind legs. He tilted his head backwards and found the creature was staring at him intently. It was a giant hairy man with the features of a monkey. What could it be? Fear and panic gripped him. This creature must be what the villagers playfully called him. It had to be the Gredpo, the Yeti. Never turn to run away from a Gredpo was another piece of advice he imagined he had occasionally heard from his grandfather. Use skillful means to save yourself. What were his skills? How could he save himself from this enormous potential enemy? Your strength lies in leather, his mind seemed to bellow. Use the leather skillfully. He slowly leaned against the boulder, straining his old legs that wanted to flee. His heart leapt and hammered wildly in his chest. He was still clutching the hide in his hand. He quietly but repeatedly chanted the holy mantra. All the while, the creature seemed mesmerized by the human's movements. It watched him without blinking. Why doesn't he grab me and crush me to death? Why all this waiting? Why doesn't he trample on me under those giant feet? But the creature was not agitated or ferocious in spite of its menacing gaze. It was absolutely captivated by this man who could not take his eyes off him. Do something quick before it does something to you, he kept telling himself. He stood still, trying to sort out his confused state. He reached for the collar of his go or his garment. He felt for the largest needle from among the three that he had stuck there and extracted it. Then he removed the cloth bag with the nettle fibers in his go pouch. He put one end of the piece of thread in his mouth to wet it. His lips were parched and his mouth was dry. Somehow his long years of practice got the better of his trembling hands and he managed to thread the needle, even without the help of saliva necessary to wet it and bind the fibers together. Taking a deep breath, Mimpema looked at the creature straight in the eye. But it was standing with his back to the sun, and he was dazzled by the bright glare outlining its form. The beady eyes danced with curiosity. He raised his feet on the boulder and showed the creature his own boots. He then placed one piece of leather on the boulder, pointed to the creature's feet, and gestured for it to place it on the hide. After repeated gestures, the creature hesitantly placed one foot on the hide, and Mimpema, slowly but gently, with quivering hands, began to pull the hide around the enormous foot and stitch the ends together. He had to constantly wipe away the beads of sweat that trickled into his eyes. Finally, the giant's foot was encased in hide. He did the same to the other foot. It seemed pleased with his new acquisition and pranced about in them. Mimpema patiently waited, letting the creature enjoy the boots while it could, for soon the wet hide, which had been stretched to its limit, would dry and contract in the sunlight, binding the feet of the wearer. Mimpema took to his heels while the creature was still absorbed in admiring itself. It viewed its feet from all directions, pointing them here and there. By now the old tanner had placed some distance between himself and his potential pursuer, when the latter began to follow him. Now he began to run for his life. As he ran, he kept looking over his shoulders at his pursuer. The hide must have been starting contracting, for the creature was limping. There was a bead of sweat on every remaining strand of hair on Mimpema's head as he ran on furiously. The creature could be seen in the distance, dragging his feet and shuffling in the dust, barely able to move. The pain must have been excruciating because it was moaning with a sound which resembled a whistle. Soon the creature was just a speck in the distance, which became smaller and smaller and finally disappeared altogether. When Mimpema reached his home, he was trembling uncontrollably and he was ashen grey. He was speechless and disoriented, startling at his own shadow. Something was seriously wrong with the man. When his condition did not change over time, the ritual of Laku was performed to help him restore his spiritual and physical balance. Months passed before Mimpema was finally able to regain his speech and talk of his encounter. He continued his work with leather, but responded resentfully when anyone called him Gredpo or Yeti, for he alone knew what a real Gredpo or Yeti was. Thank you.